In a world where protocol rules everything and traditions are written in stone, sometimes the smallest gestures can shatter the most rigid barriers. What happens when an 8-year-old girl's innocent act of kindness stops an entire royal parade in its tracks? When centuries of military discipline meets the pure heart of a child, the result is a moment that reminds us all what truly matters. This is the story of how one little girl's secret gesture changed everything, proving that compassion knows no rank, no rule, and no boundary. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Edinburgh as thousands of people lined the historic Royal Mile. It was the second day of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Flags fluttered from every window. Children clutched small Union Jacks in their tiny fists, and the air buzzed with excitement that only comes with such momentous occasions. Among the crowd stood 8-year-old Emily Thompson, her bright blue eyes wide with wonder as she pressed against the metal barriers with her grandmother, Margaret. Emily had been looking forward to this day for weeks, ever since her grandmother had promised to bring her to see the royal guards march in their magnificent red tunics and tall bearskin hats. "Granny, will they really not move even if I wave at them?" Emily whispered, tugging at her grandmother's coat sleeve. Margaret smiled down at her granddaughter, adjusting Emily's small pink dress that they had picked out specially for the occasion. "That's right, love. They're trained to stand perfectly still, no matter what happens around them. It's called being at attention." Emily found this fascinating and slightly sad. She couldn't imagine not being able to wave back when someone was being friendly. Her young mind struggled with the concept of such rigid discipline, especially when it meant ignoring the smiles and waves of excited children. As the morning progressed, the crowd grew thicker. Families squeezed together trying to get the best possible view of the street where the parade would pass. Emily, being small even for her age, found herself struggling to see over the taller adults around her. Her grandmother lifted her up whenever possible, but Margaret was 73 and couldn't hold her granddaughter for long periods. "I can't see, Granny," Emily said, her voice slightly disappointed as she stood on her tiptoes, still blocked by the sea of people in front of her. A kind stranger, a middle-aged man in a tartan scarf, overheard and offered to let Emily sit on his shoulders when the parade began. Margaret was grateful for the stranger's kindness, and Emily beamed at the prospect of getting a perfect view. As they waited, Emily observed everything around her with the intense curiosity that only children possess. She watched the police officers checking the barriers, the street cleaners making sure everything was spotless, and the photographers setting up their equipment. But what captured her attention most were the stories her grandmother told about the royal guards. "They come from all over the United Kingdom," Margaret explained, her voice carrying the pride of someone who had lived through many royal celebrations. "Some of them are very young, not much older than your cousin James. They train for months to learn how to march perfectly, how to stand without moving, and how to honor their duty to the crown." Emily listened intently, her imagination painting pictures of these young men learning to be so still and strong. "But don't they get tired, Granny? Don't their feet hurt?" "I'm sure they do, sweetheart," Margaret replied, smoothing Emily's hair. "But they do it because they believe in serving something bigger than themselves. It's about honor and duty." The concept of duty was something Emily was beginning to understand. She had duties too, keeping her room clean, helping her mother with groceries, being kind to her little brother even when he was annoying. But standing perfectly still for hours seemed like the hardest duty she could imagine. As the morning wore on, Emily noticed an elderly woman struggling to see from her wheelchair several feet away. The woman, who appeared to be in her 80s, had positioned herself hopefully behind the crowd, but clearly couldn't see anything past the standing spectators. "Granny, why is that lady so far back?" Emily asked, pointing discreetly. Margaret followed her granddaughter's gaze and her heart softened. "Oh dear. She probably couldn't get closer because of her wheelchair. That's very sad. I'm sure she'd love to see the parade too." The idea that someone might miss such a wonderful event simply because they couldn't stand or push through the crowd seemed terribly unfair. She watched the woman for several minutes, noticing how she kept trying to crane her neck to catch even a glimpse of the street. "Could we help her?" Emily asked. "The crowd is too thick now, love." There's nowhere for her to go," Margaret explained gently. Emily accepted this answer but continued to glance back at the woman throughout the morning. She made a mental note of exactly where the lady was sitting, her heart heavy with the unfairness of the situation. At exactly 11:30, the first sounds of the approaching parade reached their ears. The distant rhythm of drums and the faint melody of bagpipes caused a ripple of excitement to run through the crowd. Children were lifted onto shoulders, cameras were raised, and everyone pressed forward slightly. Eager for the first glimpse of the procession, Emily found herself hoisted up onto the shoulders of the kind stranger, and suddenly she could see everything. The view was magnificent. The entire length of the Royal Mile stretched out before her, with the historic Edinburgh Castle providing a dramatic backdrop. "Here they come!" someone shouted, and Emily's heart began to race with excitement. First came the mounted police, their horses stepping proudly down the ancient street. Behind them, the pipe band appeared, their music now clear and stirring. But it was the sight of the royal guards that truly took Emily's breath away. They marched in perfect formation, their red tunics brilliant in the morning sun, their bearskin hats adding an impressive 8 inches to their already considerable height. Every step was synchronized, every movement precise. They looked exactly as Emily had imagined, like toy soldiers come to life, but somehow more magnificent and more human at the same time. As the guards drew closer, Emily could see their faces beneath the shadow of their hats.
They were indeed young, many of them appearing to be in their early 20s. Their expressions were serious and focused, their eyes fixed straight ahead, as they had been trained to do.
The crowd cheered and applauded as the guards passed by. Children waved frantically, adults called out appreciatively, and cameras clicked constantly.
But true to their training, the guards looked neither left nor right. They maintained their disciplined formation, their steady pace, and their professional demeanor.
Emily watched in fascination, but also with growing sadness. These young men, serving their country with such dedication, couldn't acknowledge the appreciation and joy of the people they were protecting and serving.
They had to ignore the smiling faces, the waiting children, and the calls of thanks from grateful citizens. As the main body of guards passed directly in front of her position, Emily found herself studying their faces more closely. Despite their stoic expressions, she could see something in their eyes. A hint of warmth, perhaps even amusement at the enthusiasm of the crowd, especially the children.
One guard in particular caught her attention. He was marching in the third row, a young man who couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old.
There was something about his face that reminded Emily of her cousin James, kind eyes and a gentle expression, even beneath the formal military bearing. This guard was directly in front of the elderly woman in the wheelchair when Emily remembered her earlier concern.
Glancing back, she could see that the woman was indeed missing everything, blocked completely by the crowd and unable to move to a better position. In that moment, Emily made a decision that would change everything.
Without thinking about protocols or rules, without considering the consequences or the attention it might draw, Emily acted on pure compassion. She reached into her small purse and pulled out something she had been carrying with her all morning. A small bouquet of flowers she had picked from her grandmother's garden that morning as a surprise. The flowers were simple: a few daisies, some sweet peas, and a sprig of lavender. Emily had thought they might make a nice gift for her grandmother after the parade, a way to remember their special day together. But looking at that young guard and thinking about the elderly woman who couldn't see, Emily had a different idea. As the young guard marched directly in front of her position, Emily leaned forward from her perch on the stranger's shoulders. With the innocent boldness that only children possess, she held out the small bouquet toward the marching soldier.
"For you," she called out softly, her young voice carrying just far enough for the guard to hear. "Because you're doing such a good job. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared on social media around the world, and remembered as one of the most touching moments of the entire Jubilee celebration." The young guard, Corporal David Mitchell of the Scots Guards, had been maintaining his disciplined march when he heard the small voice. Against every instinct of his training, against everything he had been taught about maintaining formation and ignoring distractions, he glanced toward the sound. What he saw was an 8-year-old girl with bright blue eyes and a sincere smile, holding out a simple bouquet of garden flowers with the kind of pure generosity that adults rarely display. For a split second, time seemed suspended. David had been in the military for 4 years. He had served tours in Afghanistan, had participated in numerous ceremonial duties, and had always prided himself on his discipline and professionalism. But in that moment, faced with such innocent kindness, something deeper than training took over. The other guards continued their march, unaware of the drama unfolding just steps away. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that something unprecedented was happening but not quite sure what. Corporal Mitchell's steps began to slow, almost imperceptibly at first. His eyes met Emily's, and in that gaze was a recognition of something pure and good in a world that often seemed complicated and harsh. Emily continued to hold out the flowers, her smile never wavering, her gesture entirely free of any desire for attention or recognition. She simply wanted to give something beautiful to someone who was working so hard and couldn't acknowledge the appreciation of the people around him. The guard's formation began to drift slightly as David's pace changed. The soldiers immediately behind him had to adjust their steps to avoid collision, causing a subtle ripple effect through the ranks. David looked ahead to where his commanding officer was marching, then back to the little girl with the flowers. In that moment, he made a decision that would define not just this day, but his entire perspective on service and humanity. He stopped walking. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The guards behind him had to halt quickly to avoid running into him. The perfect formation that had been maintained for the entire length of the Royal Mile suddenly had a break in it. Officers began to notice. Photographers turned their cameras toward the disruption, and the crowd fell into a puzzled silence. But David Mitchell's attention was focused entirely on Emily Thompson and her small bouquet of garden flowers. He turned slightly toward her, a movement that would normally result in severe disciplinary action, and for the first time since the parade began, he smiled. It was a real smile, warm and genuine, that transformed his formal military bearing into something entirely human. Emily's face lit up with joy. Her gesture was being accepted, her kindness was being acknowledged, and the rigid barrier between the disciplined soldier and the appreciative public was being bridged by nothing more than flowers and compassion. What happened next would surprise everyone, including David himself, and would turn a simple act of kindness into a moment that would touch hearts around the world. Corporal David Mitchell reached out and gently took the small bouquet from Emily's outstretched hand. The flowers seemed even more delicate in his large gloved hands, but he held them with the care one might reserve for the most precious treasure. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Emily and those immediately around her to hear. Those two simple words, spoken with genuine gratitude, seemed to hang in the air like a benediction. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, suddenly erupted in applause. But this wasn't the polite ceremonial clapping that had accompanied the parade thus far. This was something deeper, an emotional response to witnessing a moment of pure human connection that transcended protocol and tradition. Emily beamed with happiness, clapping her small hands together in delight. Her grandmother Margaret had tears in her eyes, overwhelmed by pride in her granddaughter's compassionate gesture and moved by the guard's gracious response. Major Harrison Webb, the commanding officer leading the parade, had noticed the disruption in formation and was walking back to investigate. As he approached, the crowd's applause began to fade, replaced by a tense anticipation of what would happen next. Everyone understood that what they had just witnessed was unprecedented, and many feared that the young guard might face consequences for breaking protocol. David Mitchell stood at attention, still holding the flowers, his eyes now fixed straight ahead as his training demanded. He awaited his commanding officer's response, knowing that his actions, while heartfelt, had violated fundamental rules of military ceremony. Major Webb was a career military man with 28 years of service. He had overseen countless ceremonial duties, always insisting on the highest standards of discipline and protocol. His reputation was built on maintaining the dignity and precision that the public expected from the Royal Guards. As he approached Corporal Mitchell, Major Webb's mind was racing. The proper response would be to quickly restore order, continue the parade, and deal with the disciplinary matter privately later. The eyes of thousands of spectators, not to mention numerous cameras and media outlets, were focused on this moment. But as Major Webb drew closer and saw the scene more clearly, the young soldier holding a child's simple bouquet, the 8-year-old girl glowing with happiness at her gesture being accepted, the crowd's emotional response to this display of human kindness, something shifted in his perspective. Major Webb stopped in front of Corporal Mitchell and assessed the situation. He looked at the flowers, then at Emily, who was still perched on the stranger's shoulders, watching with wide eyes to see what would happen to the nice soldier who had accepted her gift. "Corporal Mitchell," Major Webb said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. "Yes, sir," David responded crisply, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty about what was to come. The crowd fell completely silent. Even the children stopped their chatter, sensing the gravity of the moment. Emily's smile faded slightly as she began to worry that she might have gotten the kind soldier in trouble. Major Webb looked once more at the flowers, then at the expectant faces of the crowd, and then something remarkable happened. The seasoned military officer, who had built his career on unwavering adherence to protocol, made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Those are beautiful flowers, Corporal," he said, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "A gift freely given deserves to be properly honored.
The crowd began to murmur with excitement, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. "Sir?" David asked, not quite understanding what his commanding officer intended. Major Webb turned toward Emily, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of hope and concern. He removed his own ceremonial hat in a gesture of respect that sent ripples of amazement through the spectators. "Young lady," he called up to Emily, "that was a very kind gesture.
Would you like to come down here and meet Corporal Mitchell properly?" The crowd gasped collectively. This was completely outside any ceremonial protocol anyone had ever witnessed.
Margaret looked around uncertainly, not sure if this was really happening or if she was misunderstanding something.
The kind stranger who had been holding Emily immediately understood the significance of the moment and carefully lowered her to the ground.
Margaret took her granddaughter's hand and, with encouragement from the people around them who stepped aside to create a path, walked toward the barrier. Police officers, initially uncertain about how to respond to this break-in security protocol, looked to each other and then to Major Webb for guidance. The Major nodded to them, indicating that this deviation from normal procedure had his approval. A section of the barrier was opened, and Emily, holding tightly to her grandmother's hand, stepped into the street where the Royal Guards were standing.
The other soldiers in the formation remained at attention, but their eyes reflected their amazement at what was unfolding. As Emily approached, David Mitchell knelt down to her level, bringing himself from his impressive military height to a position where he could speak with her face to face.
The flowers looked even more precious in this new perspective, and his genuine smile made him seem less like a forbidding military figure and more like the young man he truly was. "What's your name?" David asked gently.
"Emily," she replied, her confidence returning now that she could see he truly wasn't angry about her interruption. "Well, Emily, these are the most beautiful flowers anyone has ever given me. Thank you for being so thoughtful." Emily's face lit up again. "I picked them from my granny's garden this morning."
"The daisies are my favorite, but I thought you might like the lavender too because it smells nice."
David brought the small bouquet to his nose and inhaled deeply. "They smell wonderful." "You know, Emily, I've been marching in ceremonies for 4 years and no one has ever given me flowers before." "Really?" Emily asked, surprised.
"That seems sad. Don't people know that you're working really hard?" "Well," David chuckled, "most people understand that we're not supposed to stop and talk during ceremonies."
"What you did was very special." Major Webb, who had been watching this exchange with growing emotion, realized that something profound was happening here.
This wasn't just a child giving flowers to a soldier. This was a reminder of why they served, of the human connections that make duty meaningful, and of the importance of compassion in a world that often seems to prioritize rules over humanity. But Emily wasn't finished. She had remembered something that had been troubling her all morning. "Mr. Soldier," she said, tugging gently on David's sleeve, "there's a lady over there in a wheelchair who can't see anything because of all the tall people. She looks really sad about missing everything." Emily pointed toward the back of the crowd where the elderly woman was still sitting, largely forgotten by everyone else in the excitement of the moment. David followed Emily's gesture and spotted the woman she meant. Major Webb also looked in that direction, and both men immediately understood what Emily was suggesting, even though she hadn't directly asked for anything. "You noticed her?" David asked, his respect for this 8-year-old girl growing by the moment. "She's been there all morning," Emily explained. "Granny said there wasn't room for her to come closer, but I thought maybe since you're in charge of things, maybe someone could help her see too." Here was a child who, in the midst of her own excitement and the unprecedented attention she was receiving, was thinking about a stranger who was missing out on the celebration. It was exactly the kind of selfless thinking that military service was supposed to embody. "You know what, Emily?" Major Webb said, making another decision that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. "I think that's an excellent idea. Corporal Mitchell, would you escort our young friend here to invite that lady to join us?" The crowd, which had been watching this entire exchange with growing amazement, now began to understand what was happening. People started looking around to spot the elderly woman Emily had mentioned, and when they located her, several spectators began spontaneously creating a pathway for her to move forward. David stood up and formally offered Emily his arm, as if she were a distinguished guest at a state dinner.
"Miss Emily, would you do me the honor of helping me invite that lady to join our ceremony?" Emily giggled at the formal gesture, but accepted his arm with the seriousness of someone who understood she was participating in something important. Together they walked through the crowd toward the elderly woman, whose name, they would soon learn, was Rose Peterson.
Rose was 87 years old, a widow who had served as a nurse during the later years of World War II. She had come to the celebration alone, hoping to see the Guards march, because her late husband had served in the same regiment 60 years earlier. As David and Emily approached, Rose looked up with confusion and wonder.
She had been aware that something unusual was happening in the crowd ahead of her, but couldn't see what it was. Now, suddenly a royal guard in full dress uniform was walking toward her, accompanied by a small girl in a pink dress. "Excuse me, ma'am," David said formally as he and Emily stopped in front of Rose's wheelchair.
This young lady noticed that you couldn't see the parade from back here, and she thought you might like to join us up front." Rose's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to be any trouble." Emily stepped forward, her natural compassion overriding any shyness she might have felt.
"It's not trouble at all. The nice soldiers want you to come see everything properly.
And look, I gave him flowers from my granny's garden." She pointed proudly to the bouquet still in David's hand, and Rose smiled through her tears at the obvious joy and pride in Emily's voice. "Those are beautiful flowers, dear," Rose said.
Just like the ones my mother used to grow." The crowd had been watching this exchange with growing emotion, and several people stepped forward to help. Within moments, a clear pathway was created, and willing hands began assisting Rose's wheelchair forward through the crowd. As they moved toward the front, Rose explained to Emily and David that her husband had been a guardsman and that attending this celebration was her way of honoring his memory. Emily listened with the intense attention that children give to stories about people they care about, and David found himself deeply moved by this connection between past and present service. When they reached the front of the crowd, Major Webb was waiting. He had made one more unprecedented decision during their absence. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, having learned her name from people in the crowd, "would you do us the honor of reviewing the rest of our formation? As the widow of a guardsman, you have certainly earned that privilege."
Rose could barely speak through her tears.
The idea that she would be treated as an honored guest rather than an inconvenience was overwhelming. I would be deeply honored," she managed to say. What happened next transformed what had begun as a simple ceremonial parade into something entirely different. Major Webb directed his men to form up in a line facing Rose, Emily, and Margaret, who had joined them at the front. The crowd, understanding that they were witnessing something historic, grew completely quiet. David still held Emily's flowers, but now he did something that would be remembered as one of the most touching moments of the entire celebration. He carefully divided the small bouquet, keeping some of the flowers for himself but placing the rest gently in Rose's lap. "From Emily," he said simply, "and from all of us who serve today, to honor those who served before us." Rose picked up one of the daisies and held it to her face, breathing in its simple fragrance. "Harold would have loved this," she whispered, referring to her late husband. "He always said the best part of being a guardsman was knowing he was making ordinary people feel special and protected." Emily, who had been watching Rose carefully, suddenly had another idea. Without any prompting from the adults around her, she climbed up onto her grandmother's lap and then carefully maneuvered herself so she could sit on the arm of Rose's wheelchair. "Now you can see everything perfectly," Emily announced, as if solving the visibility problem had been a complex engineering challenge she had just completed. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Here were 3 generations, Emily representing the future, Rose representing the past, and Margaret representing the present, united by a simple act of kindness that had brought them all together. Major Webb looked at his formation of guards, all of whom were clearly moved by what they were witnessing, and made one final unprecedented decision. "Guards," he called out in his commanding voice, "in honor of Mrs.
Rose Peterson, widow of Guardsman Harold Peterson, and in recognition of Miss Emily Thompson's demonstration of the compassion that makes service meaningful, you have permission to acknowledge our honored guests." What happened next had never occurred in the history of Royal Guard ceremonies. As one, the entire formation turned toward Rose and Emily and, in perfect synchronization, they saluted. The sight of 30 Royal Guards saluting in perfect unison toward an 8-year-old girl and an elderly woman was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. The crowd stood in absolute silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude and beauty of what they were seeing, before breaking into the most thunderous applause of the entire day. Emily waved enthusiastically from her perch on Rose's wheelchair, delighted that the soldiers were finally able to acknowledge all the people who had come to see them. Rose raised one trembling hand in acknowledgement, tears streaming down her face as she experienced a moment of recognition that her husband could never have imagined. David Mitchell, still holding his portion of Emily's flowers, felt something profound shift within him. This ceremony, which had begun as a routine duty, had become something transformative. He realized that in all his years of service, he had never felt more connected to the true purpose of what he did than in this moment, when protocol had given way to humanity. Margaret Thompson watched her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and amazement.
Emily's simple act of kindness had created something beautiful and meaningful that no amount of planning or preparation could have achieved. She understood that her granddaughter had learned something important today about the power of compassion and the courage to act on it. As the applause finally began to fade, Major Webb faced a practical problem. The parade schedule was completely disrupted, and they had attracted the attention of media outlets and officials who would undoubtedly have questions about the significant departure from protocol. But looking at the faces around him, his own men, who seemed more proud and purposeful than he had ever seen them, the crowd who had witnessed something genuinely meaningful, and especially Emily and Rose, who had created this moment through nothing more than kindness and recognition, he realized that some things were more important than schedules. "Mrs. Peterson," Major Webb said, approaching Rose's wheelchair, "would you and Emily be willing to accompany us for the remainder of our route? I believe our formation would be honored to have you both as our guests." Rose looked up at him with wonder.
"Are you certain that would be appropriate, Major?" "Ma'am, I have never been more certain of anything in my military career," he replied. "What happened here today is exactly what our service is meant to represent.
"It would be our privilege to have you with us." Emily clapped her hands together excitedly. "Can we really march with the soldiers, Granny?" Margaret, who had been quietly overwhelmed by the morning's events, nodded with tears in her eyes. "I think that would be wonderful, sweetheart." And so, in a departure from centuries of military tradition, the Royal Guards reformed their ranks to include two very special guests. Rose's wheelchair was positioned alongside Major Webb at the front of the formation, with Emily walking beside David Mitchell, still carrying her flowers like a small standard bearer. The crowd that lined the streets for the remainder of the parade route had heard through social media and word of mouth that something extraordinary was happening.
As the reform procession moved forward, people cheered not just for the Guards, but specifically for Emily and Rose, whose story was already spreading far beyond Edinburgh. Emily walked with the confidence of someone who had discovered that kindness could change everything.
She chatted quietly with David as they marched, learning that he had a younger sister about her age, that he had grown up on a farm in Wales, and that he had joined the Guards because he wanted to serve something bigger than himself. "Like helping people see parades?" Emily asked, referencing their assistance to Rose. "Yes," David smiled, "exactly like that." Rose, for her part, was experiencing something she had never expected to feel again. The sense of belonging, of being honored and valued, brought back memories of her late husband and the pride he had taken in his service. She held Emily's remaining flowers carefully in her lap, treating them like the precious gifts they were. As they continued down the Royal Mile, Rose began to share stories with Emily about what Edinburgh had been like during the war, how different the city looked then,
and how proud she was to see it thriving and celebrating now.
Emily listened with fascination, her young mind captivated by these glimpses into history from someone who had lived through it. The parade route, which normally took 45 minutes to complete, stretched to over an hour, as the procession stopped several times to accommodate the wheelchair and to allow Emily and Rose to interact with other spectators who called out to them.
Each stop seemed to generate more goodwill and positive energy, transforming what had been a formal ceremony into a genuine celebration of community and human connection. At one point, they passed a group of school children who had been brought to watch the parade as part of a history lesson.
When the children saw Emily walking with the Guards, they began calling out questions and compliments. Major Webb, continuing his day of unprecedented decisions, called a brief halt to allow Emily to speak with her peers.
"How did you get to march with the soldiers?" one boy called out.
Emily, now completely comfortable in her role as an honorary member of the procession, replied, "I gave them flowers from my granny's garden, and they liked them so much they asked me to come with them." This simple explanation, delivered with the straightforward logic that only children possess, seemed to perfectly capture the essence of what had happened. The children cheered and waved with renewed enthusiasm, understanding that sometimes the simplest gestures could lead to the most amazing adventures. Rose, watching Emily interact with the other children, marveled at the girl's natural ability to bring joy and connection wherever she went. "You have a very special granddaughter," she told Margaret, who was walking alongside the wheelchair. "She's always been like this," Margaret replied proudly. "She notices when people need kindness, and she acts on it without thinking about herself." As they neared the end of the parade route, Emily began to feel sad that their adventure was coming to an end. She had enjoyed every moment of walking with David and the other Guards, learning about their duties and their lives, and especially sharing the experience with Rose. "Will I be able to see you again?" she asked David as Edinburgh Castle came into view, marking the conclusion of their route. David knelt down to Emily's level once more,
his formal military bearing softened by the genuine affection he had developed for this remarkable little girl. "Emily, what happened today was very special."
"I don't know if we'll see each other again, but I will never forget you or your flowers." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin from his uniform. Not an official insignia, but a small shamrock that his sister had given him for good luck. "I want you to have this, to remember that kindness is the most important thing you can give someone." Emily accepted the pin with the solemnity of someone receiving a great honor. "I'll keep it forever," she promised. Rose, who had been watching this exchange, had her own gift to offer. From her purse, she pulled out a small photograph, a picture of her and her husband Harold on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant in their formal clothes. "Emily, dear," Rose said, "I want you to have this picture."
Harold would have loved meeting you today, and I think he would want you to remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do is bring people together.
Emily looked at the photograph with reverence, understanding instinctively that this was something precious and meaningful.
"He looks very nice," she said. "And you look very pretty in your dress." As the formal conclusion of the parade approached, Major Webb gathered his men for final instructions, but before dismissing them, he wanted to address what had happened during their march. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying both authority and emotion, "today you witnessed something that reminded us all why we serve. The discipline and protocol that we maintain are important, but they exist to serve a larger purpose, to protect and honor the people we represent. What Miss Emily and Mrs. Peterson showed us today is that our service is most meaningful when it connects us to the humanity we're sworn to protect." The guards listened with attention and respect, understanding that they had participated in something that would define their understanding of service for the rest of their careers. The flowers that Corporal Mitchell received today, and the gesture of inclusion that we offered to Mrs. Peterson, represent the best traditions of our service, not the rigid adherence to rules, but the compassion and recognition of human dignity that those rules are meant to serve. David Mitchell stood a little straighter, still holding Emily's flowers, proud not just of his military bearing, but of the human connection he had chosen to honor. As the ceremony officially concluded, the crowd began to disperse, but many people approached Emily, Rose, and Margaret to express their appreciation for what they had witnessed. Children asked to see Emily's pen, adults thanked Rose for her husband's service, and several people commented that this had been the most meaningful parade they had ever attended. A reporter from the local newspaper asked if she could interview Emily about her experience. Emily, with her grandmother's permission, explained once again how she had simply wanted to give something nice to the soldiers who were working so hard. "Did you know that giving flowers to a guard during a parade had never happened before?" the reporter asked. Emily thought about this seriously. "No, but maybe that's because nobody thought to do it before. Sometimes you have to be the first person to do something nice." This simple wisdom, delivered by an 8-year-old girl who had just accidentally created a historic moment, seemed to perfectly capture the essence of what had occurred. As the Thompson family prepared to leave Edinburgh that afternoon, Emily clutched her shamrock pin and Rose's photograph, treasures that would remind her of this extraordinary day for the rest of her life. Rose, meanwhile, pressed the remaining flowers from Emily's bouquet in a book, creating a permanent reminder of the moment when a child's kindness had brought such unexpected joy into her life. The story of Emily's gesture and the Royal Guard's response spread far beyond Edinburgh in the days that followed. Social media posts, news articles, and television segments shared the tale of how one little girl's act of kindness had transformed a formal ceremony into a celebration of human connection. David Mitchell found himself contacted by reporters and well-wishers from around the world, all wanting to hear about his decision to accept Emily's flowers and participate in the unprecedented events that followed. He always emphasized that Emily deserved all the credit for creating the moment, and that his role had simply been to recognize and honor the kindness she had shown. Major Webb, rather than facing disciplinary action for allowing the departure from protocol, received commendation from his superiors for his handling of an unexpected situation with wisdom and compassion. The military leadership recognized that the positive publicity and genuine goodwill generated by the day's events had done more to enhance public appreciation for the Royal Guards than years of perfect but impersonal ceremonies. Rose Peterson became something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at schools and community events about the importance of kindness across generations. She always spoke about Emily's natural compassion and the reminder that young people could teach adults valuable lessons about what truly mattered in life. Margaret Thompson watched her granddaughter process the experience in the weeks that followed, seeing how Emily had internalized the lesson that small acts of kindness could create big changes. Emily continued to look for opportunities to brighten other people's days,
understanding now that such gestures were not just nice things to do, but powerful forces for bringing people together. The flowers from Emily's bouquet, pressed and preserved, eventually found their way into the regimental museum where they were displayed alongside other significant artifacts from the Guard's history. A small plaque explained their significance. Flowers given by Emily Thompson, age 8, to Corporal David Mitchell during the 2026 Platinum Jubilee Parade, representing the power of kindness to unite service members and the public they serve.
But perhaps the most lasting impact of that day was the change it created in the hearts and minds of everyone who witnessed it. Emily had demonstrated that children could lead by example, that kindness transcended all barriers, and that sometimes the most meaningful moments came not from careful planning, but from spontaneous acts of love and recognition.
Rose had shown that wisdom and grace could be found in every generation, and that honoring the past while embracing the present created connections that enriched everyone involved. David and his fellow guards had learned that their service was most meaningful when it remained connected to the human values it was meant to protect, and that flexibility and compassion could enhance rather than diminish their honor and effectiveness. And all the spectators who would witness these events carried with them the memory of a moment when everything had come together perfectly, not because protocols were followed flawlessly, but because people had chosen to see each other's humanity and respond to it with openness and love. In a world that often seemed divided by differences and conflicts, Emily Thompson's simple gesture of giving flowers to a royal guard had created a brief but powerful reminder that kindness, recognition, and human connection could bridge any gap and transform any situation.
It was a lesson worth remembering, and a story worth telling, for generations to come.